Breaking news is coming out of Detroit, and it immediately changes the conversation around the offensive line and the direction of this roster heading into the next phase of the offseason. The Detroit Lions have made a move at the center position, bringing in Cade Mays, formerly of the Carolina Panthers, on a 3-year deal worth $25 million, with $14 million of that fully guaranteed, according to league sources. This signing signals that the Lions are officially moving forward with a new starting center, and that player will now be Cade Mays, replacing Graham Glasgow in the middle of the offensive line. Now, if you're a Lions fan watching this, the first thing you probably want to know is exactly who Cade Mays is and what he brings to the table. He's a young player, just 26 years old, standing 6'6" and weighing around 325 pounds. Physically, he fits the mold of what teams look for in a modern interior offensive lineman. During the 2025 season with the Carolina Panthers, Mays started 12 games at center, although earlier in his NFL career, he actually spent time playing guard. That versatility is something Detroit clearly values because it gives the coaching staff flexibility if injuries hit during the season. When you look at his performance metrics, the numbers paint a pretty balanced picture of the type of player Detroit is getting. His overall grade as a center last season was 62.4, which ranked 24th out of 40 qualifying centers. In pass protection, however, he performed noticeably better with a 69.4 pass blocking grade, ranking 13th among centers. That suggests he can hold his own when protecting the quarterback, which is obviously critical for a Lions offense built around Jared Goff and a passing game that relies heavily on timing and protection. Where Mays will need to improve is in run blocking. His run blocking grade was 58.4, ranking 33rd out of 40. For a team that likes to establish the run and control the line of scrimmage, that's an area where development will be expected. It's also important to be realistic about what this signing represents. Cade Mays was not necessarily the dream scenario many Lions fans had in mind when looking at the center market. There were other names that people hoped Detroit might pursue, but the reality of this free agency period is that the center market turned out to be unusual. Many moves happened through trades rather than traditional signings, and that made it harder for teams like Detroit to land the top targets they might have originally been interested in. So instead of a splash move, what the Lions have done here is secure a young starting level player at a relatively reasonable price. And from the team's perspective, there is still a plan behind this. Mays is expected to step in as the starting center, but because he can also play guard, the Lions have some flexibility with how they build the rest of the offensive line depth chart. Tate Ratledge is projected to take over at right guard, while players like Mahogany and Frazier could compete for interior roles as well. Meanwhile, Detroit still has options behind Mays at center, including depth players like Scruggs, who have experience snapping the football and can step in if needed. Another key element here is the NFL draft. Even with Mays now in the building, there's a strong possibility the Lions could still draft another center or interior lineman later in the draft, possibly in the 5th or 6th round. The idea would be to add another versatile lineman who can develop behind the starter while also serving as insurance across multiple positions. But while the Lions addressed one position on the offensive line, the rest of free agency has created new questions across the roster. One of the biggest pieces of news is that Amik Robertson is leaving Detroit. He has signed with the Washington Commanders on what appears to be a 2-year deal worth around $16 million, with $9.3 million guaranteed. This one stings for the Lions because Robertson was a versatile defensive back who could play in the slot, line up outside, and move around the secondary depending on the matchup. Losing that type of flexibility creates a hole that now needs to be filled. The Lions were reportedly in discussions with Robertson and his agents about a possible extension during the NFL Combine, but those talks clearly didn't lead to a deal, and now Detroit finds itself with another question mark in the secondary. Depth and reliability are suddenly concerns again, especially when you consider the injury issues that have affected several defensive backs on this roster. At the same time, there are already conversations about potential replacements or solutions. One possibility that could emerge is bringing back Rock Ya-Sin, who served as a backup last season and already has familiarity with the system. That kind of move wouldn't necessarily solve everything, but it could help stabilize the depth chart while the team continues evaluating other options. And the truth is, is, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the Lions have already lost several players during this early stage of free agency. Along with Robertson's departure, there have been other notable exits, and that raises the stakes for the rest of the offseason. Another major name leaving Detroit is Alex Anzalone. The veteran linebacker has signed a 2-year contract worth $17 million with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, bringing his time with the Lions to an end. For many fans, this move was not entirely surprising, but it still represents a significant change for the defense. Anzalone had been an important presence in the linebacker room and a leader in the middle of the defense, so replacing that experience and communication will not be simple. There had been rumors that Anzalone could end up with teams like the New York Jets or the Chicago Bears, but in the end, he chose Tampa Bay. The Buccaneers now get a veteran linebacker who brings leadership, familiarity with complex defensive systems, and plenty of starting experience. For Detroit, however, it means yet another position where the roster suddenly has a question mark. The linebacker situation becomes even more complicated when you consider that Malcolm Rodriguez is currently a free agent as well. As of right now, he is not officially on the roster, which means the Lions could potentially be looking at a significant reshaping of that entire position group. Losing multiple players in the same unit forces the front office to think carefully about how they want to rebuild the depth chart, and this is where the NFL draft begins to look more and more important for Detroit. Based on how free agency has unfolded so far, the draft might end up being the primary way the Lions address several of these needs. Whether it's linebacker, secondary help, or additional offensive line depth, the draft board could play a massive role in shaping the 2026 roster. One of the reasons for this quieter approach in free agency could come down to finances. The Lions have not been making the kind of aggressive moves that some fans expected. Instead, the team has made one notable signing with Cade Mays and allowed several players to walk. That raises questions about the salary cap situation and whether Detroit is holding back resources for future moves. There has been speculation that contract restructures involving key players like Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown could create additional cap space, but those details are not always immediately reported. In some cases, teams finalize restructures behind the scenes, and the information does not become public until later. So just because nothing has been announced yet does not necessarily mean the Lions have not taken steps to free up money. Still, there is another rumor floating around that has caught the attention of fans. Reports mentioned by Woodward Sports suggest that Brad Holmes might be approaching this offseason as something close to a gap year. If that idea were actually true, it would be a controversial way to look at things because the Lions currently have a roster filled with young talent that many people believe is ready to compete right now. Think about the core players on this team. Jared Goff is established at quarterback. Jahmyr Gibbs continues to emerge as a dynamic offensive weapon. Penei Sewell anchors the offensive line. Amon-Ra St. Brown remains one of the most reliable wide receivers in the league. And on defense, Aiden Hutchinson is one of the most impactful young pass rushers in football. When you have that kind of talent in place, the idea of slowing things down for a transitional year becomes difficult for fans to accept. From the fan perspective, especially those who spend their hard-earned money on tickets at Ford Field, the expectation is simple. They want to see a team that is pushing forward and trying to win. They want to see the Lions competing every single season, not stepping back and waiting for another opportunity later. So right now, the situation feels a little uncertain. The Lions have made a move to stabilize the center position with Cade Mays, but they've also lost important contributors like Amik Robertson and Alex Anzalone. Several areas of the roster now depend on how the front office approaches the next phase of the offseason, especially the draft. And that brings us to the big question that Lions fans are starting to ask. Is this just the calm before the storm, with more moves coming soon, or is Detroit truly planning to take a quieter path through this free agency period and rely heavily on the draft to fill these holes? What do you think about everything that has happened so far with the Lions in free agency? Do you believe the Cade Mays signing is a smart move for the offensive line? And how concerned are you about the departures of Amik Robertson and Alex Anzalone? When you take a step back and really look at what these early free agency moves mean for the Detroit Lions, the picture becomes a lot clearer. This isn't just about a single signing or a few players leaving. It's about the direction the roster is starting to take and how the front office is choosing to build the team for the next next stage of contention. The addition of Cade Mays tells us that the Lions wanted to secure stability at the center position without overcommitting financially. At 26 years old, Mays fits the timeline of a roster that is still built around young core players. He has starting experience, he has positional versatility, and he comes in on a deal that does not cripple the team's salary cap flexibility. That matters when you look at the bigger picture. Detroit still needs room to maneuver in future seasons, especially with key players already on major contracts. But even though Mays is expected to be the starting center, the Lions clearly understand that the offensive line cannot rely on one solution. Depth has been a huge part of this team's identity over the last few seasons. Injuries happen in the NFL, and when they do, teams need players who can step into multiple roles. That's why the possibility of drafting another interior offensive lineman later in the draft still makes a lot of sense. A guard-center hybrid in the 5th or 6th round could give Detroit another developmental piece while also strengthening the depth chart. The offensive line itself is beginning to look younger overall. Tate Ratledge stepping into the right guard role is another sign of that transition. Meanwhile, players like Mahogany and Frazier could be competing for opportunities inside as well. Competition across the interior line could end up being one of the most interesting position battles to watch once training camp eventually arrives. But the offense isn't where most of the concern is right now. The bigger story might actually be on the defensive side of the ball. Losing Amik Robertson removes a versatile defensive back who could line up in multiple spots in the secondary. Losing Alex Anzalone takes away a veteran voice at linebacker who helped organize the defense. When two players with those types of roles leave in the same offseason, the ripple effect can be significant. The secondary, in particular, suddenly feels uncertain. Robertson had the ability to play both inside and outside, which allowed the coaching staff to adjust matchups depending on the opponent. Without that flexibility, Detroit now needs to think carefully about how they rebuild that part of the roster. Bringing back someone like Rock Ya-Sin could provide some familiarity, but it wouldn't completely solve the issue. There are also ongoing concerns about health and consistency among several defensive players. Injuries have already been part of the conversation, and when depth becomes thinner, those concerns grow even larger. A team with playoff ambitions cannot afford to enter the season without reliable options across the defensive backfield. Then there's the linebacker position. With Anzalone gone and Malcolm Rodriguez currently a free agent, Detroit could end up reshaping that entire group. The draft once again becomes the logical place to look for answers. Linebackers who can contribute early while developing into long-term starters are always valuable, especially for teams trying to maintain a balance between youth and experience. All of this brings the conversation back to Brad Holmes and the philosophy guiding this offseason. If the Lions truly are taking a more cautious approach in free agency, then the draft board is going to carry enormous importance. Every selection will matter, and hitting on those picks could determine whether this roster takes another step forward or simply treads water for a season. At the same time, it's also possible that the Lions are simply waiting for the right opportunities. Free agency can move quickly, but sometimes the best moves happen after the initial wave when prices drop and teams become more flexible. Detroit may still have moves coming that we simply haven't seen yet. For now though, the reality is clear. Cade Mays is the new starting center. The Lions have lost Amik Robertson and Alex Anzalone. Several positions across the roster now need attention, and the next few weeks will be crucial in determining how those holes are filled. This is the kind of moment in the offseason where everything can change quickly. One signing, one trade, or one draft pick can completely shift the outlook of a team. And with the Lions still holding a talented young